Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm here to tell you, my name is Emily Lucio, and I'm here to talk to you today about making your events and meetings accessible. We are excited to have a large group with us today. So let's just get right into it. I can figure out how to advance my slides. There you go. Okay. So some of the things to look at when planning an accessible event are event location, the audio and visual, interpreting and transcribing, seating, dietary restrictions, service animals and emotional support animals, alternative print formats, web-based meetings, and publicity, including websites. So we're going to talk about each of those things during the event. I also just want to share with you that Allison, who is working with this event on this webinar with me, is going to be monitoring the chat and also be putting some links in there that I think will be helpful to you. So let's talk about event locations. So all meetings and events should be scheduled in an accessible room where possible. And if for any reason a non-accessible meeting room is chosen and the sponsor receives a request for an individual with a disability, then the sponsor has to make every effort to work with the respective room scheduler to find an alternative location that is accessible. So right now, we do have some mechanisms in place that will tell you when you're scheduling a room if the room is accessible, which is helpful, but not for everywhere. And I think it's important to note that you want to just be aware of where accessible rooms are when you're planning your event. It's much easier to schedule a room that's accessible from the beginning than it is to retroactively go back and try and add that later. So if you can do that by default, that's really great. You also want to make sure that there's parking nearby along the path of travel to the facility, especially accessible parking, and that the path of travel to the entrance is accessible. Or if not, if there's an alternative route and if it's well marked. And as you know, we have a lot of construction going on around campus, so be aware of that because sometimes there are alternative routes due to construction. Okay, so then the second thing is that with the entrance to your event location, always you want to check and see if there are automatic doors. And then the meeting room, if you're using a meeting room, is it fixed seating? Are there areas for wheelchairs? If you're setting up the room with chairs, if you can set it up to allow for room for a wheelchair without creating a fire hazard, that is a really welcoming way to set up the room. And what I mean by that is you can either leave chairs off the ends of the aisles, and or you can make the width between the rows wider so a wheelchair can get through, so they could choose to sit almost anywhere. So either one of those two things would be acceptable. And then you also want to say, is the presentation area accessible to wheelchairs? So keep in mind, if you're having a speaker or a presenter, you always want to ask, is there an accessibility issue we can help you address if needed, right? So perhaps your speaker uses a wheelchair and you want to make sure that your presentation area, especially if there's a stage or a platform, is wheelchair accessible. Are there accessible restrooms nearby? That's always handy to have. And if you rent out a space on campus to an external group, it's important to make sure that the contract includes language with their responsibilities to comply with the ADA. So if you are in one of those departments that does generate revenue by renting out your space, just keep that in mind. Audio visual is the other area that's important to make accessible. When you're putting on your event, you do have a responsibility under the ADA to furnish appropriate auxiliary aids and services when necessary to ensure effective communication with disabilities. So I'm going to give you, sorry, I was looking at my screen, some examples of that. So assistive listening devices. You may or may not be familiar with that, but let me explain what it is. So for somebody who is deaf and uses a hearing aid, there are different devices that are usually attached within a podium mic that can by radio wave signal or whatever it's called connect to a remote device that connects to a person's hearing aid, and that way they can hear directly what's coming through the speaker. Sometimes you may have seen where a speaker or presenter is wearing like a little lavalier mic with a little box nearby them. That's the other way to do it if it's not already built into the mic. Right now, all Maryland lecture halls are required by code to have assistive listening technology built in the AV system. So if you're using a lecture hall for your event, they should have that built in. and it can be utilized throughout the receiver with the event organizer, and the receiver piece that goes to the individual who's deaf can be checked out from the classroom support office. Capital One Field at Maryland Stadium and the Xfinity Center also have assistive listening devices built in, and headsets are located at the Fan Assistance Center upon request. So we do have some of those available. The other thing is that if you're not using one of those lecture hall or something in the athletics area, ADS also has those devices available for students registered with their office. So if you're showing a video, please make sure it's captioned. As you've seen probably a lot recently on Zoom. Allison, did we turn the captioning on?
I'll turn it on now.
Thanks. It should be turned on whenever you're doing, or have the option to be turned on when you're doing a video. So if the video is being shown during a training or other event, every effort should be made for the event to either purchase captioning, purchase it with captioning, or add captioning later. Adding captioning later is a lot more difficult. So it's better if you're going to purchase something to see if you can get it with captioning, or if you're going to use YouTube. They have automatic captioning. It's not great, but it is an option. If your presentation includes a PowerPoint or any video graphic, obviously you want to try and make every effort to describe or read what's on the slide for any participant who is blind. Oftentimes people, when they think about captioning, they think only about individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing, but there is descriptive captioning for those who are blind and low vision. So if you're using any type of visual image, you want to be able to describe that as well. And then consider sending a Word version document of the PowerPoint to somebody who's blind or low vision in advance. So the next piece is interpreting and transcribing. When you're planning an event, I highly recommend that you look into the cost of what an interpreter would be when you're planning the event, and that you budget for that during your planning process. Oftentimes people plan events and they don't include that in the cost, and then if someone makes a request, then they don't have the money for that. And unfortunately, we can't deny that. Someone has to pay for that, and it's usually the person who's planning the event. So I do encourage you to budget for that as you're planning for the event. But what I also recommend you do is if you reserve an interpreter early, which is always a good idea because they are in high demand in this area, is to keep note of what the cancellation policy is, because if you don't get a request for one, you do have the right to cancel it. As long as you cancel it within their cancellation policy, you won't be charged. So always make a note of that. When you're reserving an interpreter, make sure they know the date and time of the event, the location, the structure of the program. So is it going to be one speaker, multiple speakers, breakout sessions, things like that? Because all of that's important for them to know, so they can determine how many interpreters to reserve. So some of the best practices when working with interpreters and transcribers is to make sure you've got all the program information, including the agenda with names and copies of any speeches from your speakers, and provide that to the interpreter 2 to 3 days in advance. They're usually used to there being last minute changes, but especially if the lecture is based on something with technical terms, it's helpful for them to have, or complicated names, it's helpful for them to have that information early on, so that they can practice that and make sure they've got it right. Also, interpreters are part of your stage setup. So if you've got a podium, for example, include a chair, and if appropriate, especially if they have a script, a music stand right next to the podium, so that they're next to the podium and can hear everything without being disrupted. So that's helpful. They do need to be placed next to the speaker to ensure visibility. The other thing you can do sometimes, especially with a larger event, is provide the interpreter a wireless headset that's connected to the speaker's microphone, and that will enable the interpreter to hear the speaker more effectively for large events. They should also be in a well-lit area and easily seen. So you want to keep in mind that if you turn the lights off or anything, that the person who is deaf is no longer has access to the information from the interpreter. So please keep that in mind as you're planning the event. If you're planning to show a short video clip and planning to turn off the lights, how you're going to work that so the interpreter is not impacted. And then transcribers should be seated in a location. The difference is that obviously an interpreter, I'm assuming most people know that's using American Sign Language. But some people who don't use American Sign Language prefer a transcriber, which is usually on a computer screen. So I would put the transcriber somewhere seated in a location where they can best hear the speaker, and also a wireless headset. This can also be done remotely, and it is done remotely more often than not. It's also less expensive when it's done remotely. But you want to make sure that there is a way for the individual who requires the transcriber to be able to see the transcription, whether that be on an individual laptop or a large screen projected with the transcription. When you're planning your seating, you do want to make sure you have some reserved seating available, particularly for any guests who are going to be using a sign language interpreter. If your sign language interpreter is at the front next to the podium, what you want to make sure is that your seating is close by there as well. I often get the question is that we have special seating for the speakers or invited guests up front. Do I have to put those needing an interpreter there as well? Ideally, it'd be best if you could, but I would put them just as close as you possibly can to the interpreter. And guests who use a wheelchair, obviously they should be able to sit comfortably with their friends and companions. We want to try to avoid them being isolated or segregated. So again, like I mentioned earlier, when you're doing this setup, make sure you look at where that access is. If you need to remove chairs, and make sure that there is companion seating next to the wheelchair area. I would try to avoid just saying like the whole back row is for wheelchairs, because then they're not sitting necessarily next to the people they came to the event with. You're also segregating them in one section and also relegating them to the back. So just be aware of those things as you're planning your seating. In addition to wheelchairs, you also want to keep in mind that there may be people with limited mobility issues who don't use wheelchairs, who can't walk up and down stairs. So if you are hosting an event in, say, an auditorium classroom, they may not be able to, navigate the stairs easily. So I would also encourage you to reserve, put a note on the seat that says reserve seating for mobility, things like that, to make sure that there is space available right at the top or right at the bottom near the entrance, and then right on the aisle seat to make sure that they can get in. Okay, oftentimes people don't think about dietary restrictions. I know we deal a lot with people who voluntarily choose to be vegan or vegetarian, but we also have people who have specific medical conditions, which can be a serious issue, and we want to make sure we're addressing their medical needs as well. So it's important to include things like gluten-free or anything else. I often recommend that if your event is providing food, to make a note on the registration. It says, do you have any medical dietary restrictions that we need to address in terms of the food offerings or whatever. So that's always helpful to put that statement in your materials and allow people to indicate that, and then work with them to make sure that there is something that meets their needs. One other note of caution is if you're going to automatically include vegetarian options and vegan options, you may also want to include automatically gluten-free options. But keep in mind that if you get somebody who makes a note that they require a gluten-free option, I'd make sure to get their name and I'd make sure to put it on that meal. If you're like done prepackaged meals or something, because I have seen situations where somebody who hasn't made that pre-request sees the gluten-free meal and says, oh, I'll go ahead and take it, not knowing that somebody had already pre-requested that. So make sure that you keep an eye on that. So I mentioned in the beginning that I was going to talk about service animals and emotional support animals. I do want to just clarify the difference. And that is that under the ADA, obviously a service animal is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The tasks performed by the dog must be directly related to the person's disability. If there's ever a question as the legitimacy of a service animal, you can only ask 2 questions. One is the dog a service dog required because of a disability? And what work or tasks has the dog been trained to perform? You may not request any documentation for the dog or require that the dog demonstrate its task or inquire about the nature of the person's disability. The ADA does also not require service animals to wear a vest, ID tag, or specific harness. I know sometimes it makes it difficult, but that is the regulations and we have to follow that. And I think I do want to make it clear that, you know, service animals are not required to be registered with disability services on campus. They're not, you know, we're not required to provide documentation for them. So they are allowed to be there and they are allowed to go pretty much any place on campus. Versus emotional support animals, that's a bit different. Emotional support animals have not been trained to perform a specific job or task. And so essentially they do not qualify as a service animal under the ADA. They have to go through an accommodation process and provide appropriate documentation. Obviously not the service animal, the individual. The individual has to go through the accommodation process with the service animal and provide the appropriate documentation. And then once they do that, then it's determined that they are appropriate. And 90% of the time for a student, for example, that means they're going to be allowed in the residence hall. It does not necessarily mean that they're going to be allowed other public places on campus. So if you come across if you're doing an event and come across an animal, you can ask those 2 questions that I said earlier for the service animal. And if it's not clear, you know, you can always refer, if it's during the workday, obviously you can call my office or you can call ADS, but hopefully it will be clear. And if the person directly says it's an emotional support animal, then you do have the right to say that the animal is not allowed. In the event another person attending the event has a severe allergy to the service animal, you want to do your best to determine how to allow both individuals to attend and find a reasonable solution. One other thing I do want to mention is that at the University of Maryland, we do not have a pet policy. So that does make it a little more complicated, but I would suggest you use your best judgment or defer to legal counsel if you have questions about that. Okay, if you're doing an event and providing any type of print materials, you do want to make sure that you have the ability to offer them in an alternative format. 90% of the time, you can do this by just emailing a copy in advance to the person requesting it, and then they can have it on their electronic device, and then they can access it easily. Once in a while, you may get a request for a large print copy or a Braille copy. I do recommend the day of the event having a couple large print copies available, because you just never know. Especially if it's a larger event. I mean, if it's a pre-registration event and you know everybody, maybe there's not. But you want to make sure that everyone is aware that, you know, if you have print copies, that you know that they're available, and you can also print it in your program that large print copies are available. Because oftentimes I get people who say, well, I printed these large print copies, but no one took them. And my first question is, well, who knew that you had them? And they said, well, I knew. Okay, but did any of your other staff know? Did any of the people handing out, you know, the programs know? And they said no. And I'll say, well, did you print it in your program to let people in the attendance know? And they said no. So, you know, they're not going to get taken if people don't know they're available. So you want to do everything you can to make sure people know that they're available. To ensure access to information about programs and events, there are some guidelines that are recommended about making documents accessible. I'm just looking, so one of the links that Allison is going to put in the chat is the large print guidelines from the American Council on the Blind. So that's one resource that I recommend in terms of large print. There's also, I'm just looking, there's the IT accessibility website on the university's campus that also talks about other ways you can make documents accessible. So you could look at that as well. When you're looking to make documents accessible, you want to maintain a copy in a Microsoft Word format. That is the easiest one to use to convert and also send so that a screen reader can read it. You want to try to avoid using images unless you have an alt tag description that can be provided on the electronic version. Try to avoid using text boxes and frames. It does make it complicated for a screen reader to read them. And you want to include a statement in the text that the publication is available in alternative formats upon request, and make sure you supply contact information. So for finished print publications, when you're fulfilling requests for alternative formats, it's responsibility of the department or office for which the publication was produced. And so what I suggest is that you designate a specific person to handle requests for publication in an alternative format. Make sure that that person is aware of some of these options and how to do that. And the preferred format for alternative format publications should be emailed or as text only Word files, which I mentioned before, and then which the requester can print out in whatever size he or she needs, or use on their electronic device. If someone requests material in Braille, what you want to do is you work with somebody to produce the materials. You're welcome to reach out to me or to ADS, and we can try and work with you to find a place to get that printed in Braille. Again, I'm going to mention that there is a cost associated with that. It is not free, so you want to try and make sure to budget for that if you can. I would just have a line on your budget that says ADA expenses. For whatever they end up being, whether it be an interpreter or Braille production. If the requester cannot receive email and request a copy in large print, it's pretty easy to request to increase the font size, and you can sort of reorient it from vertical to horizontal to make it easier, and then you can reserve a copy for them at the event to make sure they have it. These are also some other large print resources. One of them, as I mentioned, was American Council for the Blind. And then there's the best practices and guidelines for large print documents used by the low vision community, and then designing for screen reader capability. So I want to talk about making an accessible PowerPoint. You can use a sans serif font that is at least 18.22 is preferred. Use a light colored background with dark text. Use a plain background without any watermark, photo, or design behind the text. Use a PowerPoint theme to structure your presentation with only short sentences or bulleted phrases, usually about 4 lines of text, 40 words per slide. I'm going to tell you, I'm the worst about going over that. So, I know people are going to use their best judgment, but these are just the recommended guidelines. Make sure to read and describe things on your PowerPoint during live presentation. I know a lot of people get frustrated when you read your slides, but if you want to be aware of your audience and who may not be able to see them, it's always good to read them. Keep it short, and as a rule, 1 slide for every 2 minutes of speaking time. If there are photographs, images, clip art, graphics, maps, charts, keep in mind that those cannot be read by screen readers. And assistive technology is used by many people with vision disabilities. So what you want to do is, again, when you send them the copy, make sure you embed alt text or long descriptions with images and other graphic elements. There is a great webinar on making your PowerPoint accessible, or Google Slides, through the ADA Mid-Atlantic Center, and it's called Empowering PowerPoint. So I highly recommend you look at that. Couple other notes about web-based platforms. So the accessibility of your webinar will always begin and end with the webinar platform you're using. If the program is not accessible or does not include certain integrated features, your ability to provide access will be limited. And so before committing to a webinar platform, there are a few things that you should check to ensure that you will be able to provide access during your virtual events. Is the platform compliant with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act or WIC Act 2.0? Those are the standards for web accessibility. I'm not going to go into those now. That's a different webinar, but you're welcome to look that up if you want to know more information. Does the platform have an option to provide live integrated captioning? Obviously, Zoom has that option. So you want to make sure whatever platform, whether it be WebEx, Zoom, Chime, or whatever the other ones are, that they have that option built in. Other features of the platform that could help you to identify if it is compliant include accessibility of all features of the program through keyboard shortcuts without the use of a mouse, keyboard commands that allow the user to move between multiple windows on the computer, the capacity to resize the captions and change the color of the text and the font, and the flexibility to move the captioning to different locations on the screen. So your participants may have individual access needs, and this will allow them to adjust the captioning to meet their needs. Non-auditory alerts to communicate with participants. Examples of these alerts could be an icon of the raised hand, a chat box to communicate with the webinar host, or whiteboard to write notes to all participants. The ability to record or save any materials, including captioning for later review. And this allows anyone to access the materials in the same format that it was delivered and at their own pace. And then the option for screen reader users to interact with all of the program functions, similarly to those who do not use screen readers. So examples include using polling or chat features specific for presenters, and the ability to read across lines in the registration and other materials. When you're doing web-based meetings, you want to explain communication expectations of the meeting. If you want to speak, raise your hand. If you want to ask a question, use the chat. Attendees can unmute themselves. Those are types of things you want to establish from the beginning and let people know what sort of the protocol is that you're working with. There's a couple resources below providing slides and materials in alternative formats. And then you can get a plain text version of today's presentation. And then Zoom audio live transcript is available, and then how to enable the Zoom live transcript feature at UMD. There's a link for that as well. You want to provide a caption recording with the slides after the event. And then you also want to avoid virtual backgrounds. So make sure you know your audience and avoid audio described visual relevant content. The University of Maryland has an accessibility guide for Zoom presentations, and that's available at this link. So you can refer to that as well. So you might ask, how do I make sure that people know about this, and how do I make sure people request accommodations? When you're publicizing your event, you want to have an accessibility notice in all your materials that you distribute, right? Whether they be on paper or internet or email or whatever. Always have an accessibility notice. And that's in all types of different communications, including banners, posters, flyers. And the text should include the name and contact information for the individual, division, unit, or the group to contact for accommodations. And the reason I say that is, some people ask me, well, shouldn't I direct them to the ADA office? And the answer is no, because I don't know anything about your event, so I can't answer their questions. But if they're talking directly with one of the event organizers, you can have what's called an interactive conversation where you can share with them the structure of the event, and you can ask them specifically what they need, and then you can work together to determine if it's something. Again, you can email them an alternative format or whatever. But if you have further questions and you're not sure how to answer what they're asking for, you're of course welcome to contact me. On this slide, you'll see a sample statement that I recommend you using. There's two different versions. There's the longer one and the shorter one. So whichever one you have room for. I recommend the longer one if you can. But if you absolutely have no space for it, then you can use the shorter one. But that will give you a good sense of what's needed for that, and let people know that you're welcoming and inviting them to the event. When you're building web applications or websites to announce and register for an event, you absolutely want to make sure that those are accessible. So, you don't want people to not be able to register your event because the screen reader could not access the registration. So it should adhere to the following guidelines. You want to choose a content management system that supports accessibility. You want to use headings correctly to organize the structure of the content. And you want to include proper alt text for images and give all links unique and descriptive names. You also want to use color appropriately. Design all forms for accessibility. Use tables for tabular data, not for layout. Ensure that all content can be accessed with the keyboard alone in a logical way. Use ARIA roles and landmarks, but only when necessary. And for those who don't know, ARIA is Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it's a complex, sort of powerful technical specification for adding accessibility information to elements that are not natively accessible. When you're editing presentations and websites, you want to also think about color blindness. It's not as common, obviously, as other types of disabilities, but it is around. And so we want to make sure that we're being accessible to people who are colorblind as well. So you want to use patterns and textures to show contrast in graphs and charts. You want to use colors and symbols to convey error messages. You want to add text labels to color filters and swatches. You want to underline links to differentiate between regular text and anchor text. You want to avoid using poor color combinations such as green, red, and blue, purple. And you want to use size, placement, or font weights to make primary buttons stand out. And make required form fields with a symbol such as an asterisk or label them. And there's a link below for more information for colorblind users. These are a few other resources for making websites accessible. The WC3 Web Accessibility Initiative has a lot of resources, so they're all three listed there, including creating accessible forms and web accessibility tutorials. I also put a few other resources: accessible meetings and events conference guide, a planning guide for making temporary events accessible, planning accessible meetings and events, a toolkit, and then virtual meeting tip sheet. And there's the University of Maryland accessibility guide for Zoom presentations, which I mentioned earlier. This is my contact information. I'm going to stop this screen share and show you one other thing that I want to show you real quick. Let me just switch my screen here. Give me 1 second. Okay. So I wanted just to point out to you, this is the University Accessibility website. This is our one-stop shopping for everything accessibility on campus. It talks about accommodations, electronic and information technology. There is a section on event planning that talks a lot about the information that I shared with you today, and then also has some other information for you as well. So you can always go there for making, and also this presentation is down at the bottom. So you can always go there. It's actually the one from the last time we did it, but it is there. Teaching resources, physical access, emergency preparedness, transportation, visitors campus, athletics, arts and entertainment, university libraries, policies, just all sorts of information. If there's something that's not on this website that you'd like me to put on there, let me know, and let's see if it's something we can get on there. But I just wanted to highlight this for you. And also, I want to go real quickly to one other website and show you. This is the Division of Information Technology, and this is their IT accessibility website. And on here, you'll see all sorts of resources for teaching and learning, e-tools accessibility, web accessibility, video captioning, documents, procurement, training and support, web accessibility. So that all this information and resources are available to you too. And it tells you, like for example, here, how to create a PDF, accessible PDF, Google Slides. I think there's PowerPoint in here too somewhere. But anyway, that's also available too. So I wanted to make sure you were aware and saw that. And that is a presentation which got through pretty quickly. Allison, are there any questions for me to answer?
Hi, everybody. I'm here to help moderate some Q's and A's from you. So we do have 2, I think, but if you want to pop those into either the chat or the Q&A, please feel free. The first question, is there a list of accessible rooms on campus that you know of?
Yeah, so there is a room reservation system. I know there's one, I believe there's one for STAMP, and I believe there is another one that's for more places on campus. I forget what it's called, but within their reservation system, it does list if the room is ADA compliant. So it should be in there.
Cool. And feel free to pop in a follow-up on that if you have follow-ups. The second question we got is, are there any guidelines or do you have any advice regarding providing food for those who have religious dietary restrictions?
You know, that's a really good question. And again, you know, that's not a disability accommodation. Let me make that very clear. But I think we need to be sensitive to everybody, right? And of different, who have different religious dietary restrictions, cultural dietary restrictions, whatever. And so I think the way you do that is that in your registration form, you say, if you have dietary restrictions, please let us know, and leave that sort of open-ended, or you put a checklist that says, do you need vegan? Do you need vegetarian? Do you need kosher? Do you need, gluten-free, whatever the case may be, or all the alternative. And, try and make it as individualized as possible to work with them. And that's a very welcoming thing to do.
Thanks, Emily.
And Leslie put in the reservation system. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, check out that chat. I'm going to comb through it and pull out all of these links, so I know we're throwing a lot of things at you. I was just like typing the whole time in the chat. So please know you'll get all of those separately as well. This question asks, what types of things are available in an accessible meeting room at the university? And are there enough accessible rooms for multiple events?
So the answer to the second question is yes. There are multiple rooms that are accessible. And the answer to your first question, I can't tell you the answer to that really. But if you look at STAMP, right, you can get STAMP is accessible, and the rooms in STAMP are accessible. So I think that that's a good place to start. Classrooms, not all classrooms are as easily accessible. It depends what type of event you want. But as I said, lecture halls that have stairs in them could be problematic, but that doesn't mean they're not accessible per se, because if there may be a row of seating at the top or a row of seating at the bottom that is wheelchair accessible. So it helps to just go check out the room for yourself, is my suggestion, to make sure.
Great, thank you. We got a comment in the chat. It's not a question, it's a comment, but it only went to hosts and panelists, so I just want to read it aloud for everyone who is attending as well. They pointed out that it's helpful to keep containers for food for later in regards to the question about religious dietary restrictions. For example, like Ramadan, have a catering pack up a meal for folks to take at the end, right? If they can't eat due to fasting, or just have that to-go food.
I think that's a great point. I think that also holds true for a lot of people who keep kosher as well, especially during Passover.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, just the to-go containers for later. Another question popped in. Thank you all for sending these. Please keep them coming. How do you accommodate multiple languages for events?
So that's a good question. And again, it's not disability related, but I would try and work with them to see what they need, and based on the nature of your program. Obviously if it's just a presenter, you could look into getting a translator there or some other thing. I'm not familiar with what the different resources are available for foreign language transcription, but I would double check. My first resource is always to go to the individual and ask them, what is it you need, and what works best to you to help you given the nature of our event. That's the place I would start. Yeah,
for sure. I'm trying to remember, Romance Languages has a translation and interpreting service that's not for transcription per se, but on Zoom at least you can have a separate channel for, in this case we did Spanish for one of our events. So to the extent that that's a helpful option for folks, now you know.
Great.
Yeah, lots of resources here at the university. So I'm not seeing any other questions in here. Are there other things, Emily, that you really want to impart upon our audience?
I don't think so. I'm just looking, there's a list of resources. When we finish the webinar, we are going to send out a transcribed copy of a captioned copy of the webinar, some of the links and some of the comments, and we will send that out to everybody. I know there were some people who emailed us recently and said they weren't able to attend, so we will make sure that that's available to everybody. And as you just all noted, or I saw this webinar from the last time I did it is on the website, so you can feel free to share that website link with anybody you want. So other than that, I don't think I have anything.
We got another question in.
Okay,
so
great.
Saved by the bell here. What recommendations do you have for helping a department understand that ADA is really a floor, not a ceiling, right? So a starting place, and that true inclusion should look more like universal access for faculty, staff, and students.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point to make. I mean, you know, what we want to do is be as accessible and welcoming to everybody with a disability as we possibly can. And there are always ways we can improve everything we do. And so that's why I keep saying over and over again, you want to talk to the individual with a disability and listen to what their needs are. Because one of the key principles within the ADA is understanding what the specific individual's needs, and they give deference to that individual's needs. So for example, if you have two people who are deaf and hard of hearing and you want to just provide transcribing to them, but their preference is a sign language interpreter, but you know that a sign language interpreter costs more money, you always want to give deference to the individual based on what their needs are and what they want. Sometimes you can talk with them and they are very understanding. People are very understanding, right? And understand that these things cost money, and they may be willing to say, okay, we're willing to do the transcriber. But if they really say they want the the sign language interpreter, then, you know, really you want to give deference to them. So, you know, when you talk about a floor versus a ceiling, you always want to work with the individual to determine what really is going to meet their needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And recognizing that's not just a funding thing. Those are two different languages. English
Absolutely.
is not, you know, we're not using signed English, it's ASL. So
that's correct. Absolutely. And Leslie is very helpful to have.
I know, thanks, Leslie.
So she put in another resource for language resources. So thank you, Leslie, for doing that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, those are great ones. And again, from the university, which I know our business officer likes using that KFS number, and you don't have to worry about anything. So I think our questions are stopped again, but I do want to prompt you, would you like to plug your podcast, Emily?
Oh, I would be happy to. So as you may or may not know, October is Disability Awareness Month. And you know, you can put the link to the one that appeared up today. October Disability Awareness Month, and as part of Disability Awareness Month, we are hosting a weekly podcast where I've been interviewing individuals on campus who have disabilities about life with their disability. And we've done 3 so far, and they have been amazing. The first one was sent out yesterday, and Allison just put the link to the podcast in the chat. So hopefully you'll all listen to that. And if you're not subscribed to the ODI newsletter, hopefully you will do that. I think Allison's on that right now, putting in a link to how to do that. Because the next 2 will be coming out in the weeks to follow, and then we are in the works to get the 4th one. So hopefully we will have 4 for this year, for this semester, for this month. And all 3 that we've done have been very different and all very good. So I'm excited about that. You will see there are, if you read this week's newsletter, are you putting a link to the whole newsletter in there?
I can, yeah.
If you read this week's newsletter, you will see there are lots of references to Disability Awareness Month in there, and things going on around campus. So hopefully you will take advantage of all of those. So I guess, Allison, unless we have more questions, I'm good. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone for attending. This is great, a great turnout. I hope the information was helpful. I am here always to answer your questions, and you can reach out to me anytime. The other thing I'm happy to do is, as you're planning your event, if you would like me to attend your event planning meeting once or twice, or maybe the whole thing, you know, you're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to try and attend and give some advice. And Leslie also put the Disability Awareness Month stuff from PCDI on there, so those are all in there too.
There's some really cool looking events. Like, I'm not helping with any of the rest of them, so this is not self-promotion. Like, I'm marking my calendar for a bunch of these, so please take a look at that. There's a really good slate of events from PCDI. I did throw in a link to yesterday's newsletter. Shamelessly self-promoting, like, sure, yes, subscribe for that. But yeah, the first podcast dropped just last night. There's a transcript also available on the website, which I linked to, or you can watch it or listen to it as a YouTube video. And 3 cheers to Leslie for being our links helper today. We're not paying her to do that, but there's actually one last question I'm seeing came in. Is transportation information like university buses and cars available when you're attending an in-person event?
So all of the transportation accessibility information is on the website that I pointed out to you earlier, under the section that says transportation. You know, we have our buses accessible, but we also have point-to-point access transportation available that people can register for, and all of that information on how to do that is on the website.
Yeah, links all day. So just pop that one in there. Really, like, your home base for things accessibility is just accessibility.umd.edu. And then also remember IT accessibility, just add an IT right at the beginning, .umd.edu.
We made it
Those are
simple
both
and
super
easy.
helpful, super helpful.
Yes.
I refer to them all the time. So
Yep.
Yeah.
Again, accessibility.umd.edu. Go right there and you'll find all the information. And if you forget the IT one, there's a link in that to it. So
yeah,
we made it
bookmark
easy.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also some forums on the accessibility website too, if you want to share information with us too. So you can do that too. So.
For sure. Cool. That is actually all of our questions now, and we can give folks a few minutes back of their day.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for attending. Again, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Emily Lucio. I'm the ADA coordinator, and I really enjoyed talking to all of you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Have a good afternoon, everybody.